In the shadowed recesses of Whitehall Palace, on the eve of the king's departure for the fields of France in 1513, Catherine of Aragon stood motionless before the gilded mirror. Her reflection, a fragile covenant with the dawn that promised bloodshed and glory. The chamber doors creaked shut like the jaws of some ancient beast awakening from slumber, sealed by the royal seal imprinted with the Tudor rose, its thorns a silent omen of the pain to come. The air grew thick with the scent of wine, incense, myrrh and frankincense, heavy and cloying, meant to purify what was already defiled by the inexorable decree of power. She was commanded to utter no word of farewell, no whisper of his name, lest it summon ill omens to the battlefield where thousands would clash in the name of empire. Her lips, once curved in the quiet counsel of a devoted wife, now pressed into a vow of silence that echoed through the empty halls like the tolling of a distant funeral bell. Guards, their eyes cold as the iron hilts of their swords, took positions at the thresholds, their ledgers bound in leather and ready to chronicle every sigh, every tremor of her form, as if her very breath might betray the realm's fragile dominion. For 7 nights she would fast, her body a vessel hollowed by ritual, inspected by physicians who prodded and probed under the flicker of candlelight, their gloved hands invading the sanctity of her person, seeking signs of impurity that could curse the Tudor banners and turn victory to ash. The weight of the crown she wore felt heavier than ever, not as a symbol of queenship, but as a yoke forged in the fires of patriarchal fear, binding her to an existence where autonomy dissolved into obedience. Ask yourself, listener, why such intimacy became the first battlefield, why power, in its most tyrannical guise, began not with the clash of swords or the thunder of cannons, but with the unmaking of a woman's soul, layer by layer, until only echoes remained. This was no aberration of a single monarch's whim, no fleeting shadow cast by the capricious sun of Tudor excess, but rather the echo of an apparatus forged in the crucibles of antiquity, repeated across empires where kings, cloaked in the illusory mantle of a divine right, imposed edicts upon their consorts before unleashing the fury of war upon the world. From the towering ziggurats of Mesopotamia, where the code of Ur-Nammu etched such decrees into clay tablets that outlasted the very cities they governed, to the sun-drenched palaces of ancient Egypt, where pharaohs like Thutmose III bound their queens in rituals of seclusion before campaigns against the Hittites, from the opulent, spice-laden courts of Persia, where Darius the Great enforced silence upon Atossa to safeguard his Scythian conquests, to the marble forums of Rome, where emperors from Augustus to Trajan decreed bodily purifications for their empresses, prior to legions marching on Parthia or Germania. The pattern endured like a vein of unyielding ore through the bedrock of history. In the mist-shrouded castles of medieval Europe, from the Norman strongholds of William the Conqueror to the Gothic spires of the Plantagenets, this ritualized dominion transformed the queen's chamber into a prelude of conquest, her fragility the sacrificial offering to ensure victory abroad, her suffering the unseen price paid for the glory that historians would later romanticize. Henry VIII, that colossus of the Renaissance, with his booming voice and unquenchable thirst for legacy, merely inherited and amplified this perversion, his 6 wives ensnared in a web of restrictions that blurred the line between superstition and calculated cruelty, each one a thread spun from the loom of fear. Behind closed doors, as the drums of war beat distant thunder across the Channel, these women, Catherine of Aragon, resolute and pious, Anne Boleyn, fiery and intellectual, Jane Seymour, gentle and yielding, Anne of Cleves, diplomatic and yielding, steadfast, Catherine Howard, youthful and tragic, Catherine Parr, scholarly and resilient, suffered not as queens adorned in velvet and jewels, but as prisoners of an ancient fear, the fear that a woman's autonomy might unravel the threads of empire, exposing the fragility beneath the facade of invincibility. And in this revelation we glimpse the moral weight of it all. How power, ever hungry, devours the intimate first, turning love into leverage, devotion into dread. Imagine, if you will, the illusion of grandeur that veiled these horrors with such masterful deception. The opulent tapestries of Hampton Court Palace, woven with threads of pure gold and crimson silk, depicting heroic triumphs of ancient gods and mortal kings, their battles, rendered in eternal splendor to inspire awe in all who beheld them. The grand halls alive with the clamor of courtiers in their finery, silks rustling like whispers of conspiracy, jewels glinting under the light of 1,000 beeswax candles, the air perfumed with rosewater and the faint tang of spiced wine poured from goblets chased with silver. Laughter echoed like a symphony to the king's unassailable nobility, a chorus that drowned out the sobs from the inner chambers. Processions of musicians with lutes and viols filled the corridors, their melodies a balm for the soul of empire. Henry VIII strode these corridors as a god incarnate, his broad frame clad in armor forged by the finest Milanese smiths, gleaming under torchlight that cast long shadows like the reach of his ambition. His voice, deep and resonant, boomed edicts that reshaped nations, defied the Pope himself in the schism that birthed the Church of England, and proclaimed a new era of Tudor supremacy. The world beyond the palace walls saw only splendor, the divine war against religious schism, the brutal conquests in France and Scotland that promised eternal dominion, the pageantry of the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, where kings met in tents of tenty, embroidered velvet to feign brotherhood before the inevitable clash of arms. Yet beneath the robes of velvet and ermine, heavy with the embroidery of lions and dragons symbolizing unyielding strength, lay a darker truth, a shattering revelation that pierced the heart of this gilded facade like a dagger through silk. Before every march to battle, kings like Henry first conquered the hearth, the very nucleus of their realm, turning the palace into a cage disguised as a temple, where marble columns, rows like bars and frescoed ceilings depicted heavens that offered no mercy. These restrictions were no mere superstitions born of primitive ignorance or the mists of pagan belief. They were instruments of dominance, meticulously encoded in sacred texts from the Babylonian Talmud to the medieval canon law of Gratian's Decretum, blessed by ecclesiastical hands that anointed the king's will as divine ordinance, enforced by the specter of treason, the rack's cruel embrace, or the blade of thief. Executioner at the Tower scaffold. In the Tudor court, as in the empires that preceded it, from the Assyrian kings who ritualized their queen's isolation in Nineveh to the Byzantine emperors who veiled their consorts in Constantinople's labyrinthine halls, the queen's body became the microcosm of the state, her silence a metaphor for the subdued masses yearning for voice, her isolation a blueprint for the iron grip upon lands yet to be claimed, her fasting a rehearsal for the famines that war would impose upon conquered peoples. Power, you see, always begins at home, in the most intimate defilement, where fear masquerades as piety, control as covenant, and the wife's chamber becomes the forge where empires are tempered in the fires of subjugation. Listener, ponder this. In the glittering illusion, how many eyes were averted, how many tongues stilled to preserve the myth of noble rule? The grandeur was but a veil, thin and translucent, through which the perversion seeped like poison into the veins of history. To dissect these rituals is to unearth a forensic history, not of legends spun from the threads of myth, but of cold, unyielding fact, vellum and gold leaf, and the trembling testimonies of those who endured, their words preserved in diplomatic dispatches, court diaries, and the confessional whispers, recorded by chroniclers like Polydore Virgil or the Venetian ambassadors who spied upon the Tudor intrigues. Across cultures, from the sun-baked plains of ancient Egypt where the Nile's floods mirrored the ebb and flow of royal decrees, to the fog-laden isles of Britain where Celtic mists concealed druidic influences upon early monarchs, kings imposed laws upon their queens that isolated, starved, and surveilled, all under the guise of preserving a purity demanded by the gods of war, whose altars demanded blood not only from foes, but from the very heart of the household. In Mesopotamia, under the stern gaze of Hammurabi's code inscribed upon the diorite stele, now housed in the Louvre-shadowed vaults, queens like those of the Babylonian courts, women of high birth, schooled in cuneiform and statecraft, were confined for lunar cycles, their chambers sealed with waxen insignias bearing the king's cartouche, doors bolted against the world with iron bars forged in the temple smithies, windows shuttered to the light of day by heavy drapes of linen dyed in royal purple. Only a solitary lamp, fueled by sesame oil and tended by eunuch servants, flickered in the gloom, casting elongated shadows that mirrored the void within her soul, as maids were forbidden entry without the king's proxy, their footsteps echoing like what? Judgments in the corridor, Dardal. This edict of isolation eroded the spirit, tethering her existence to his absence, a psychological unmaking justified by the superstition that her gaze upon the outer world might invite divine disfavor upon the legions, summoning storms or plagues to ravage the phalanxes. Henry VIII echoed this in his own reign, commanding Catherine of Aragon to withdraw into seclusion before his 1513 campaign against Louis XII of France. Her chamber at Richmond Palace, a tomb of a living isolation, where even the rustle of silk against stone was deemed a potential omen of defeat, the hours stretching into eternity as she paced the confines, her mind a whirlwind of unspoken prayers and suppressed rage. The ritual's cruelty lay not merely in the physical barriers, but in the erosion of time itself, days blending into nights without the rhythm of courtly life, her isolation a deliberate unmaking that prepared her for the role of enduring widowhood, should the gods decree otherwise. Deeper still delved the vow of silence, a perversion that stripped the voice from the queen's throat like a thief in the night, silencing the one instrument that could challenge or console. Forbidden to utter the king's name, to evoke his oath, image in song or sigh, or even to murmur prayers that might carry his essence into the ether. She communicated through gestures alone, subtle nods of the head, the flicker of fingers like shadows on a wall. Her words lashed into oblivion under penalty of exile to remote manors or the cold embrace of a nunnery's cloister. In ancient Persia, amid the echoing halls of Persepolis carved from roseate limestone, Achaemenid rulers like Darius the First, this upon consorts such as Atassa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, believing that spoken memories disrupted the king's spiritual armor on the field, inviting the wrath of Ahura Mazda upon the immortal guards. Byzantine empresses like Theodora, that formidable advisor to Justinian, suffered it before. The emperor's wars against the Vandals in North Africa, their courts reduced to pantomimes of muted despair where scribes noted every attempted syllable as a breach of covenant. In Norman England, following the conquest of 1066, Queen Matilda of Flanders, wife of William the Conqueror, endured the hush before the invasion's bloody aftermath. Her advisory whispers, once vital to the Domesday Book's compilation, silenced as if they carried the seeds of rebellion. Her silence a veil that hid the seeds of rebellion. Her silence a veil that hid the strategic mind beneath. For Henry VIII's wives, this ritual grew more insidious in the bedchamber's confines, where tapestries of hunting scenes mocked her immobility. Anne Boleyn, vibrant and sharp-tongued, with her French education and reformist zeal, was bound to this vow before the king's Scottish expeditions in the 1540s, her silence a rehearsal for the greater muting that would precede her trial and execution on Tower Green, her unspoken thoughts, perhaps of the daughter she bore. Elizabeth, twisting like knives in the quiet, it assaulted the soul, listener, rendering her fragility a crime against the crown, her unspoken thoughts a threat to the dominion she was meant to embody, transforming eloquence into entrapment, and the thawing eloquence into entrapment. Chamber into a vault where words died unborn. Consider the psychological toll, days of enforced quietude, where the mind screams in silence, building a pressure that could shatter the strongest will, all to affirm the king's unchallenged voice as the realm's sole echo. The ritual of fasting followed, a bodily hollowing that weakened the frame as surely as chains bound the limbs, turning sustenance into a symbol of submission. For 3 days, or sometimes 7, depending on the astrologers' ominous readings, prior to the king's march, Queens abstained from all sustenance, save sips from sacred wells blessed by the royal chaplains, their forms inspected daily by priestesses or physicians clad in somber robes, for traces of transgression. Scents on the breath like forbidden fruit, crumbs hidden in the folds of elaborate gowns, the unnatural pallor of cheeks betraying hidden indulgence that might pollute the war effort. In Egypt, during the New Kingdom's zenith, Nefertari, the beloved consort of Ramses II, fasted before the epic battles of Kadesh against the Hittites. Her emaciated silhouette paraded in temple reliefs as a testament to submission, offering her vitality to the war gods Amun and Montu. Her deprivation etched into the Karnak inscriptions as a pious act that ensured the pharaoh's chariot triumphs. The Abbasid caliphs, in the golden age of Baghdad's House of Wisdom, revived it in their sprawling harems, where queens like Zubaydah, wife of Harun al-Rashid, were monitored with unyielding vigilance by female overseers, their fasts documented in the chronicles of al-Tabari as safeguards against the jinn's interference in the caliph's campaigns against the Byzantines. Charlemagne's queens, including the devoted Hildegard of the Vinskau, endured it before the Saxon campaigns that forged the Carolingian Empire, their deprivation framed as purification in the royal annals, yet rooted in the fear that a nourished body bred complacency among the troops. Her hunger pangs, a distant echo of the famines that would afflict the conquered lands. Henry VIII imposed this upon Jane Seymour, his third wife, whose quiet grace masked a resilient spirit before his 1544 invasion of France. Her fasting in the Privy Chambers of Windsor Castle, a visceral symbol of the Tudor court's ritualized control, turning nourishment into a privilege revoked at whim. Her hunger a mirror to the starvation of agency that defined her role, especially poignant as she carried the find her role, heir that would become Edward VI. The ritual's darkness lay in its physicality, the gnawing void in the belly, the dizziness that clouded thought, the inspections that humiliated under the guise of sanctity, each element designed to remind her that her body was not her own, but an extension of the king's will, a vessel to be emptied before it could be filled with the burdens of potential widowhood or regency. Yet, the defilement deepened with the bodily inspection, a clinical invasion that reduced the queen to an object under the merciless scrutiny of candlelit examination, where vulnerability was weaponized into ritual. Garments stripped away layer by layer, gowns of brocade, chemises of finest lawn, her form probed by male priests or royal advisors, their fingers tracing skin for marks of infidelity, bruises like accusations from phantom lovers, blemishes or moles deemed curses that could taint the royal bloodline. Every curve, every intimate contour documented in sealed ledgers bound with brass clasps as evidence of purity or peril. The reports whispered to the king in audiences that blended piety with prurience. Roman emperors like Augustus, the founder of the Principate, decreed it for imperial consorts such as Livia Drusilla, before expansions into Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula, interpreting any impurities as harbingers of plague upon the legions. Her examinations chronicled in Suetonius's Lives as necessary for the Pax Romana's endurance. In the Holy Roman Empire, Frederick Barbarossa, that red-bearded titan, enforced it prior to the Third Crusade's call in 1189, holy men from the Teutonic orders conducting the rite with Latin prayers that masked the profound humiliation. The queen's body, a symbolic battlefield mirroring the Holy Land's sands. Eleanor of Aquitaine, the indomitable queen first of France and then England, faced analogous examinations under her second husband Henry II for the wars in Ireland and Wales, her legendary beauty, and Wales. Political acumen subjected to this degradation in the Angevin court's hidden protocols, as noted in the Pipe Rolls and Chronicler Gerald of Wales's accounts. For Catherine Howard, Henry VIII's tragic fifth wife, whose youthful allure captivated the aging king only to seal her doom. This ritual manifested in the oppressive surveillance of the bedchamber before his northern campaigns against Scottish incursions. Physicians' hands, cold and impersonal, invading her privacy to affirm her pristine sanctuary. projecting the king's mounting insecurities onto her flesh, where superstition and dominance intertwined in a grotesque dance that foreshadowed her accusation of adultery and execution at 19. The inspection's perversion was its care. Intimacy turned invasive, a desecration that blurred the boundaries of flesh and sovereignty, reminding her that even her body harbored threats to the throne, her purity a fragile edifice upheld by the very hands that sought to dismantle it. Surveillance became the vigilant eye that never slept, the unblinking vigil where armed guards rotated through the nights in shifts, dictated by the royal almanac, chronicling every movement, every fleeting glance, every dream murmured and fevered sleep, and every measured breath in exhaustive ledgers that grew thick as tomes. No visitors pierced the veil of isolation without the king's warrant. No letters crossed the threshold, their seals broken and contents scoured for sedition. Chains secured doors if whispers of unrest arose from the outer courts, and even sleep talk was reported as potential treason, punishable by the Star Chamber's Inquisition. During the 100 Years' War's interminable strife, Edward III of England imposed this upon Queen Philippa of Hainault before his campaigns in France, from the siege of Calais to the Battle of Crécy, noting even her yawns or idle fidgeting as possible signs of disloyalty in the wardrobe, accounts preserved at the National Archives. Isabella of Bavaria, consort to the mad Charles VI of France, endured it with food, tasted by poison detectors, and attire searched daily for hidden missives or talismans, her surveillance a microcosm of the kingdom's paranoia during the Armagnac-Burgundian civil wars. In Henry VIII's court, Anne of Cleves, the German princess whose marriage was a diplomatic pawn annulled for political expediency, faced this panopticon before the 1545 siege of Boulogne, her every gesture politicized. In the Privy Council's dispatches, the chamber's hidden peepholes, crafted by Italian artisans, turning solitude into a stage of perpetual judgment, infantilizing her will, and dissolving any remnant of autonomy under the guise of warding off sorcery or ring off sorcery. Foreign intrigue. The mechanism's horror was its totality. No corner unwatched, no moment unrecorded, the guard's presence a constant reminder of the eye of power, eroding privacy until the self fragmented under the weight of observation, her chamber, less a sanctuary than a prison where freedom was the ultimate illusion. The prohibition of tears added a layer of emotional amputation, banning any display of grief or fear. No quivering lips, no falling drops that might glisten like jewels of fire. Rebellion. As attendants, trained in this cruel etiquette, dabbed away violations with swift cloths, scented with lavender, confinement to darker cells, or public shaming in the Great Hall, the penalty for such weakness that could omen defeat. In Celtic Scotland, amid the heather-clad Highlands, Robert the Bruce enforced it upon Elizabeth de Burgh, before the pivotal Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. Tears seen as summoning tempests, or the wail of banshees upon the warriors, as recorded in John Barbour's epic poem, The Bruche, where her stoicism is lauded yet conceals the inner torment. The Irish O'Neill dynasty, in their Ulster strongholds, tied it to weather omens and fairy lore, chronicling such edicts in the annals of the Four Masters, where queens' suppressed sobs were believed to invite the Side's curse upon the clan's raids. For Catherine Parr, Henry VIII's final consort, a woman of intellect who penned devotional treatises and navigated the king's tempers with scholarly grace, this rule haunted the eve of his last French forays in 1544. Her natural fragility, born of genuine care for the realm's future, damned as a crime against martial resolve, forcing a stoic mask that suppressed empathy and bound her in unyielding submission. The king's fear of emotional fracture manifesting as ritualized cruelty that nearly led to her own arrest. For heresy, this prohibition struck at the heart's core, denying the catharsis of sorrow, bottling emotions until they festered, turning queens into vessels of repressed anguish, their unshed tears a silent testament to the moral bankruptcy of rituals that equated humanity with hazard. Solitary slumber followed as the night's cruel companion, queens consigned to vast, canopied beds where linens of damask were inspected daily for scents of intruders or traces of self-comfort deemed pollutants to the king's vigor and the realm's purity. Guards patrolled the antechambers with hounds trained to detect betrayal's subtle odors, and dreams were recounted upon waking to astrologers who divined omens from their content. Holy Roman Emperor Otto the Great imposed it upon Empress Theophanu, a Byzantine princess of cunning diplomacy, before his Italian campaigns in the 960s. Pipe rolls and charters of the Ottonian dynasty detailing the scented vigilance and chained bedposts as wards against nocturnal sorcery. Plantagenet kings like Henry II decreed it for Eleanor of Aquitaine before the expeditions into Wales and the Wales. Baronial revolts, her legendary wit silenced in sleep's domain as chronicled in the Historia Regum Britanniae's echoes. Catherine of Aragon knew this isolation acutely before Henry VIII's 1520 Field of Cloth of Gold, a prelude to war's tensions with France. Her bed at Greenwich Palace chained with runes of protection etched by court enchanters, intimacy desecrated into celibate vulnerability, amplifying the absence and paranoia that shadowed the throne. Her nights haunted by the phantom sounds of the court beyond, a reminder that even in repose, she was never truly alone, yet utterly forsaken. The ritual's insidiousness lay in its invasion of rest. Sleep, that great equalizer, twisted into surveillance, where subconscious wanderings became indictments, eroding the last refuge of the mind and body. But the final ritual, the oath of immobility, will shock you to the core, for it petrified the queen into a statue of marble endurance, utterly still for the campaign's span, confined to throne or bed without rising, gesturing, or even shifting her gaze from a fixed point marked by the chamber's crucifix. Fed by spoon from silver vessels, supported by silken slings if weakness encroached, monitored by physicians who adjusted her posture, with clinical detachment lest any motion invite chaos from the fates. In medieval Spain during the Reconquista's fervent push, Alfonso X the Wise codified it in the Ica Partidaces, a legal compendium that bound Queen Violent of Aragon to this stasis before advances on the Moorish kingdoms, her immobility praised in the Chronica de Alfonso X as a divine offering to Santiago Matamoros. Crusader kings in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, such as Baldwin II, bound Melisande of Jerusalem, thus during the Second Crusade's preparations, her stillness a divine ward against Saladin's forces, as noted in William of Tyre's histories, where her endurance is mythologized, yet rooted in enforced paralysis. For Anne Boleyn, the raven-haired enchantress whose marriage reshaped England before Henry VIII's 1536 suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace, a northern rebellion that tested the Reformation's fragile roots. This immobility revealed the depths of his terror, not of enemies abroad, the Scots or French, who threatened borders, but of her autonomy. The sharp mind that once captivated him with debates on scripture and statecraft, now imprisoned in ritualized stasis within the tower's confines or the palace's inner sanctums. Her body, once a symbol of passion and power, objectified as a monument to his omnipotence, erasing her voice, her will, her very humanity, in a devastating climax of control that foreshadowed her beheading, the axe falling as the ultimate enforcement of silence. Here, listener, the perversion peaked in its absurdity and horror. Kings feared not defeat in battle, with its rivers of blood and shattered shields, but the unbound spirit of the woman at their side, whose independence could eclipse their glory. Turning in him could eclipse their glory. That dread into an edict of unmaking, where devotion twisted into domination, and the chamber became the true seat of empire's darkness, a place where the soul was immobilized as surely as the flesh, leaving only the hollow shell of what once was a Queen Darrow. Now, as the echoes of these rituals fade into the vaults of time, sealed with the dust of centuries and the indifference of forgotten scribes, pull back with me from the gilded cages of history, from the Tudor palaces where ghosts of silence, women still wander the corridors, and confront the mirror it holds to our own age, unyielding and unforgiving. What kind of civilization begins its wars by silencing its women, by ritualizing their fragility into instruments of conquest that echo through the ages like a curse unlifted. These pre-war edicts, from the clay tablets of Mesopotamia where in Hedwana, the world's first named author, might have whispered of similar chains, to the Tudor bedchambers where Catherine Parr penned her prayers in secret defiance, warn of power's timeless perversion. How rituals, once sacred covenants with the divine, become cages that ensnare the soul, forging bars from the very threads of tradition. How control invariably preys upon the most defenseless, the intimate hearth where vulnerability is exploited as the foundation for broader tyrannies. In Henry VIII's court, his wives, Catherine of Aragon, who endured divorce and demotion yet clung to her title with unbreaking faith, Anne Boleyn, whose intellect sparked a revolution only to be quenched by the king's blade, Jane Seymour, whose brief tenure birthed a king but at the cost of her life, Anne of Cleves, who outlived her abuser through quiet diplomacy, Catherine Howard, whose innocence was no shield against suspicion's venom, Catherine Parr, who survived to influence the young Elizabeth, embodied this tragedy, their sufferings behind closed doors, a microcosm of the dominion that ravaged nations, from the fields of VIII, flawed into the scaffolds of the Reformation's martyrs. Ask yourself, in the quiet of this revelation, why such truths were buried beneath layers of heroic chronicles and romantic ballads, why empires veiled their intimacies in grandeur and pageantry, and what remnants of these apparatuses linger in the structures of our world, the subtle edicts that still silence voices in boardrooms, parliaments, or homes, where power's fear manifests in modern guises. If this story has unsettled you, if it has reminded you how easily devotion becomes domination, how the apparatus of control evolves yet never dies, then share it. Illuminate the shadows with your voice. For history only redeems what it remembers, what it drags into the light against the tide of oblivion. Only by uncovering these rituals, by dissecting their moral weight and visceral horror, can we strip history of its disguises, the illusions of nobility, the myths of divine right, and finally hear the voices that power tried to erase, their whispers rising like incense from the ashes of forgotten chambers, demanding that we bear witness and vow never to repeat the perversion.